Free Radicals podcast listeners. Thanks for watching this video episode of my interview with Gareth Brandt. For those of you who don't know him, Gareth is a longtime pastor and professor, most recently teaching at Columbia Bible College in Abbotsford, British Columbia. This episode is a recording of a live event we hosted here in Calgary in front of a crowd of about 50 people at Foothills Mennonite Church. This video edition includes a few things that the audio podcast episode does not. There are a few times where we are talking about images that I am showing to Gareth and the crowd there. So the audio episode obviously couldn't include that, but the video does. So stay tuned for those images. One of Gareth's strengths is his spoken word poetry, and that's included, except I've switched out the two that he did live for a recording that I have. I hope you'll enjoy this episode. Thanks again for following along. Gareth and I, when we envisioned this gathering, we had no idea what to expect. And we thought with a couple of my friends and a couple of his friends, then we might have a worthwhile event. And you've exceeded our expectations. So thanks so much for sharing your Thursday evening with us. Gareth will introduce himself shortly, but I'll start. My name is Will Lowen. Some of you will know me. I was the pastor of Trinity Mennonite Church just south of Calgary for 12 years. And I have been interested in Mennonite history for quite a while, but it didn't start out that way. When I was a child, and Gareth and I go back farther than some of you go back with Gareth. He was the youth pastor at the church where I grew up. I wasn't quite a youth then. I was too young to be a youth.
I had his older sisters in youth group.
Right, and they remember him and his wife Cindy quite fondly. And my cultural group growing up, my parents were both born in Mexico. And they came up to Southern Ontario as Old Colony Mennonites, but sort of not, right? There was you were only a good Old Colony Mennonite if you were still in Mexico. And there were questions of identity that were sort of played out in the public sphere, some of which happened at church, some of which happened in family gatherings. But the picture we got, or that I got as a young man, was that we were a humble people, a simple people, a hardworking people, and that was about it. That was all there was to know. And there were a couple of expressions. I'll test some of your knowledge of Low German, and maybe test my own pronunciation of it. There were a couple of expressions that some of you might know. Some people would sometimes say, "Da Yiliada da Fakida," right? Yeah, there's a few nods and grimaces even. There was a sense that if you would go and get higher education, there was a chance you would corrupt your very soul. And so the expression means the learned ones are the corrupted ones. And so there was always this fear of higher learning that way. But also there was an expression that I heard a few times, and it was "met uns esset nuscht." There's nothing special about us. It's sort of a way of translating that helpfully. And so that was kind of the sense that if you could hold on to the positive impressions, right, that we were a hardworking, faithful group of people who kept our noses clean, if you could hold on to that, then you could hold on to your Mennonite identity and your faith. Well, it doesn't take long sometimes, and you realize, no, some of us have not kept our noses clean. And then you wonder, well, what else is there? Well, then I got to university, and I was mostly studying math, but on the side, I would take some Bible courses and some church history courses. And in my church history courses, they used a word when they were talking about the early Mennonites that I had never heard in a church service before. And that word was radical. I studied in the 90s, and the 90s was the generation of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. When they said radical, it meant cool, popular, maybe a little bit rebellious, and none of those words had any bearing in the Mennonite community that I grew up in. We were not cool or popular or rebellious in any way. So I had to dig deeper to find out who these people were. And the more I learned, the more I wanted to learn. And I've been an enthusiastic student and storyteller of the Anabaptist community ever since.
The sad saga of Munster. War. It rages, rages, rages. In the Bible's pages, it started with Cain. Joshua killed the Canaanites, David killed the Amorites, the bloody stain. God has commanded it, evil must be eradicated, enemies must be subjugated. War, it rages, rages, rages. In history's pages, Israel versus Palestine, Muslim versus Jew, and Christians too. Protestant versus Catholic, Orthodox versus Orthodox, Russia versus Ukraine. The bullets rain. War. It rages, rages, rages. Even Anabaptists 500 years ago say it ain't so. It was so. In Munster, the city of churches. What better place to proclaim? Get ready, Jesus is coming again. The world is coming to a refrain. Come to the city of churches to be saved. Bring the blind and bring the lame. Jesus is coming again. And so they came. This is how it happened. Jan the baker from Haarlem met Jan the Buker from Leiden. Jan from Haarlem baptized Jan from Leiden. Jan from Haarlem went to Amsterdam, where he left his wife and found a queen. He gave a damn to some and loved to some and said he was a king. And then he baptized, and he baptized, and he baptized, and he baptized, until he reached 144,000. Bernard Rothman, the theologian, was one of them. He was the man in Munster. Let's be Anabaptists. Let us sing. Come to Munster, come to the city of churches, come to the city of God. Save yourselves from the corrupt generation. Come to Munster for your salvation. And they came. Munster, the city of churches, Munster, the city of God. Munster, the city of refuge, Munster, the city of peace. Only the pure and baptized shall abide. Everyone who dared resist, they died. By the hand of God, administered by the hand of man. Jan the baker man. Come to Munster, come to the city of churches, come to the city of God. Judgment day will come on the day of resurrection. Save yourselves from the corrupt generation. Come to Munster for your salvation. They came from south in Strasbourg. They came from north by sea. They came from east in Holland. They came from Westphalia. They came. And Easter came. And it was Judgment Day. For Jan the baker, he was toast. So, Jan from Leiden took control. God told him so. And the Bible told him what to do. Share your goods and take more wives. And those who didn't lost their lives, including some of Jan van Leiden's wives. Jan from Leiden was the king. God told him so. You dare not sing a protest song. When one of his wives dared to sing, he said, "Off with your head! You're better off dead." Then in front of the rest, he trampled her body. Such dread. Come to Munster, come to the city of churches, come to the city of God. Some tried, some died. Then suddenly the coming stopped. The bishop and his army, in the name of Christ, they sieged the city. They starved them out, these bloody Anabaptists. Their blood will flow, and for 2 days their blood did flow. And then it was quiet. No more to and fro. Munster, the city of churches, Munster, the city of God. Munster, the city of refuge, Munster, the city of peace. Jan from Leiden, now king in disgrace. He and his council were tortured and tried. Their bodies were pinched and pierced and fried, ripped and burned and stabbed until they died. Then hung in cages from the cathedral spire. Then hung in cages from the cathedral spire. Then hung in cages from the cathedral spire. This is what happens to revolutionaries. Let this be a warning. The cages are still there, hanging from the cathedral spire. Oh, the cages, the cages, the cages. The battle still rages and rages and rages. It was so long ago, so long. They were so wrong, so wrong, so wrong. But still, when men are wrong, we kill, we kill, we kill. With guns or words or otherwise, reprise. We do not learn from history. Instead, repeat. Instead, repeat it.
So, Gareth, thank you for joining me on the Free Radicals podcast.
Good to be here.
We talked ahead of time about what this might look like, and I asked him to give an outline of the events, and he thought it would be better for me to do that. So it took me eight episodes that were half an hour long each to tell the story, and now I'm going to try to do it in 5 minutes, not 5 episodes. 1517, Martin Luther starts to sow the seed of an idea that there could be a church in Europe that wasn't loyal to the Pope, wasn't loyal to the institution of Roman Catholicism that had had so much power for so long. And suddenly, a lot of different towns, a lot of different cities would sort of flirt with this idea. And they would bring in a preacher who had education, of course, credibility, of course, but sometimes the crowds would be a little bit more interested in someone with a willingness to push up against the boundaries. And there's a town in the northwest part of contemporary Germany called Münster. It's in the province of Westphalia. Some of you have more German credentials than I do, and you know that my pronunciation of Münster is incorrect. I apologize. Sort of. Anyways, Münster hired a priest named Bernard Rothman, and he had credentials, but he wasn't supposed to be the head priest. He was just part of the team. But Bernard Rothman had a gift. He could stir up a crowd. He could make people interested. And the people who were on the fringes, the people who didn't have power, who didn't have wealth or established a place in the city, were especially interested in Bernard Rothman. And the authorities in Münster didn't like the power that he had, but they liked that when he preached, people actually came to church. So after a while, they gave Rothman some money to go on a bit of a tour. And this is a tour that history experts like Gareth and I would love to go on. They sent him to 3 places: Wittenberg, Marburg, and Strasbourg. Wittenberg, of course, is where Martin Luther was a teacher and where he had supposedly put his 95 theses, this list of things that needed to be debated in the church, where he had stapled that to the church door. And Luther was there, and many of Luther's friends and colleagues were there and were happy to teach Bernard Rothman when he was there. Marburg was where a big gathering had happened, and Luther had fought with Zwingli about what exactly happens in the Lord's Supper. And there were people there who could continue that story and tell Bernard Rothman all about it. And then he went to Strasbourg, and in Strasbourg, he met people who were even farther on the fringes of the church, including a guy named Caspar Schwenkfeld. And it's worth pointing out, when my children were born, I was really hoping I'd be able to name one of them Caspar. But I didn't quite get the authorization I needed to make this happen. so Bernard Rothman comes back and he's emboldened by the people that he learned from, and his influence in the city is growing. And there's sort of these three powers: the established Catholic group, and the growing evangelical Reformed Lutheran group, and then this weird little group built around Rothman. They're all sort of growing and competing for space and influence. Well, all of a sudden, there's another guy who's sort of sympathetic to this Rothman movement named Melchior Hoffman. Melchior also rejected from the list of names. And Melchior Hoffman was an apocalyptic preacher. There were lots of apocalyptic preachers then, like there are now. But he had decided through his own process of interpretation that Strasbourg was going to be the new Jerusalem. This had been taught to him by whatever apocalyptic process he had. Well, Melchior Hoffman had also made some converts in what we now call Holland. But then Melchior Hoffman died in prison in Strasbourg before Christ could come back. Then one of his students, named Jan Mathis, wanted to continue the movement and decided that no, in fact, Münster was the new Jerusalem. Well, the new Jerusalem is the place to be. Jesus is coming back anytime. We should be in the place where Jesus was coming back. Mathis arrives in Munster, baptizes a group of people, including Bernard Rothman. Pretty soon, thousands of people have been baptized, and there's a movement that can't be stopped. But the Catholic Church had recently decided that Anabaptism, the kind of Christianity that Jan Mathis was preaching, was illegal. And you could kill Anabaptists, you could steal their property, and you were doing the Catholic Church a favor. So this movement continued to grow, and they thought the council would give them some toleration, some freedom, and there was all sorts of jockeying for position, and all of a sudden the council says, no, you guys are out, we can't protect you. And they gathered together in a little study group, deciding what they should do, and as they were waiting for a sign from God, the history papers say there were 3 suns appeared in the sky. Well, in the Canadian prairies, we have a name for that. We suspect, anyways, now that there were sundogs appeared in the sky. Well, they thought it was a sign from God that they should continue their movement. The Catholics had started leaving the city because they knew that the Catholic soldiers would soon come and kill all of the Anabaptists. So then the Anabaptists had enough power within the city to take over. Then they were inviting more Anabaptists from all over Northern Europe to live there. And so the Catholic soldiers started to try to surround the city. It's a big city. It took a long time for them to surround it. People started showing up, and Jan Mathis thought the end of the world was coming, but it sort of needed a boost from him. So he, on Easter morning, 1534, he got on his horse and he marched out to fight the Catholic army, thinking that when he did, angels from heaven would come and rescue him. They did not. Jan Mathis was killed, and his body was displayed on the city wall, but the movement continued, and the next leader was Jan van Leyden, who declared himself to be king, and to do that, he married Jan Mathis's widow, and the movement could continue. And they were sending out pamphlets all around to say how great of a utopia this was going to be. And one of the people who came was a lady named Hyla Fiken. And Hyla Fiken was a very spiritual woman, and she read the Apocrypha. We don't really read the Apocrypha much, but in the Apocrypha, the extra books that the Catholics use, and they would say the books that we stopped using, but that's a whole other argument. There's a story in there about Judith. And Judith was a Jew living in one of the kingdoms that had been surrounded by one of the other armies. And she decided that she had to do something about it. She had gotten an inspiration. So she went out and she seduced the military general of the army. And afterwards, he had fallen asleep, and she cut off his head and showed the army. They all left in fear, and she was a hero of the Jewish people. This is in the story of Judith. It's one of the stories we don't get to tell in Sunday school. But Hylophykon heard that story, was inspired by that story. So she went out the city gates to try the same thing. She was caught and arrested, and she was unsuccessful in trying to do what she wanted to do. So the siege is going longer. Some of the men are starting to leave so that they can get money and secure themselves, thinking that when the soldiers come, they'll kill the men and they'll leave the women alone. So they left the women behind. All of a sudden, there's 3 or 4 times as many women as men. So the leadership of Munster decided that they needed to legalize polygamy. And the king, of course, would have more wives than anyone. He had 16 wives. And all of a sudden, people around are getting more and more worried, and they're giving the Catholics more and more money to surround the city with more soldiers to end this problem. Well, there's a sympathetic group of people around where Menno Simons lived in Holland, and they wanted to sort of distract the authorities from what was happening in Munster. They were trying to set up a little mini Munster in an abbey or a monastery that they took over. But that was pretty soon overwhelmed by also Catholic soldiers, and all of them were killed, including a guy named Peter Simons, who we have reason to believe was Menno's brother. Eventually, the soldiers did surround the city completely. There were people dying, running out of food because groceries couldn't come and go. People inside of the city pretty soon betrayed the city. A few of them snuck out, told the soldiers how to get in, and the soldiers came in. They slaughtered a long list of people, arrested the ringleaders, including King Jan van Leyden. The next year, there would be a public torture. I won't go into any details there because my wife is here, and it was gruesome, as much as I'll say. And the 3 ringleaders were killed, and their bodies were hung in cages from one of the big church towers in Munster, and that was 1536 when the cages went up. It is 2024. The cages are still there. So that is the story. I wasn't looking at the clock. I may have exceeded my 5 minutes, Gareth. So you are a professor of church history. Can you help us understand what were some of the underlying causes or underlying things that made this possible, social realities, theological realities of the time?
Yeah, often it is, we tend to look at things spiritually or biblically. That's the first thing we look at. But I would say it's a social class struggle. The peasants were at the bottom of the social economic hierarchy, and they are open to people who will give them salvation, in a sense. And Rothman and other leaders in Munster, in a sense, were giving them hope that their status could be improved. And also, apocalyptic scenarios also tend to take hold in those sorts of times. For example, the earthquake in California was part of the beginning of Pentecostalism. So a lot of end times fervor happens when there are disasters or downtrodden. We should also mention there was major flooding. This is before the dikes in the Netherlands, so there had been major flooding during that time. You also have occupation happening, so it was kind of ripe for something radical to happen.
Right. Yeah, and one of the things I didn't say in my evangelical upbringing, there was all sorts of fervor around end times predictions and what were the signs of that. Well, in my university classroom, they talked about the floods, the plagues, the economic disruption, the wars, and I said, wait a second, those are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. If we have reason now in the 90s and even into the 20s to think that Christ is coming back soon, and 500 years ago they had as much and more reason to think it was coming.
Yeah, you could probably find them in almost every era.
Right.
But in particular, the 16th century, I would say, was a particularly tumultuous time.
Right. Yeah, and I think part of that too is the printing press made it possible for that news to get around quicker and
right.
cheaper than before. So we've had a chance to look at some of your paintings in the foyer, and you've been to Munster before, and you know the story very well. If I were to commission you, I'm not. Don't get your hopes up. If I were to commission you to do a few more paintings with the Munster story in mind, what kind of images do you think you would conjure up?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, even though you primed me for it before already. Perhaps I would look at it, the pieces would be emotional. So I don't know exactly what they would look like, but to me, and that was my first response when I saw the cages. It was a dreary May day, raining at an angle, with wind and cold for May, and I wept when I saw the cages, because I knew these had been people who were setting up what they thought was the peaceable kingdom of Christ using violence, and they were also put down with greater violence, both in the name of Christ. And what can you do but weep? So my pieces would be emotional pieces. Even the one that is part of the display here, I would say is an emotional piece. So I can't say exactly what I would picture, but I can tell you what I would want the art to feel like.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, there were a couple that came to mind. For me, we could kind of mix and match our artistic strategies, but I've seen people paint with gold leaf before, and gold and wealth was a part of how Jan van Leyden established himself as king, but it was also how they advertised themselves. These pamphlets that I mentioned went out and were telling the poor and dispossessed Anabaptists of Northern Europe, hey, come here, we have wealth enough to share, and they literally had nothing to lose. So I wonder if you could sort of, I'm not an artist, but you could contrast the gold leaf with some simple and plain images, which that's not a watercolor technique, which is what you use.
Yeah, yeah, you can't use gold leaf in watercolor. I think I understand the technique of gold leaf. They use that with cracks in pottery, and I think I would use perhaps a mosaic with broken pieces would be an appropriate one, and if I could go to Munster and pillage some pieces found on the street, that might be an appropriate medium to use.
All right.
I think either broken pieces of pottery or broken stones or anything like that would be appropriate, I think.
Yeah. All right. So I've put together a bit of a slideshow. Bill is going to follow us through it. I'm just going to call it up here. So the first one that we're going to look at is your Cages painting. I'll just slide it out here for us. So yeah, you talked about how this is literally what was happening when you were there. It was raining a lot. This is sort of a dreary color scheme, if that's the right word to use. And you talked about how this had you're trying to convey emotions. You yourself were weeping at this. Is there anything else you wanted to say about the?
Yeah, there is no color in it.
Okay.
The cathedral does have a bit of brown in it, but I decided to. My paintings generally are realistic, or attempted realistic, but I decided to just do it in black and white and shades of gray, very very deliberately. For that reason.
Yeah.
It's not colorful.
Right. Yeah, and and we sort of talked about this too. You know, sort of going there, not sure of what to expect, and some of that color, maybe that beauty was missing, that we were sort of looking for. Okay, so the next image. So this is a piece of art you saw among the cobblestones. If you could tell the story about that.
Yeah, it's an inlay in the street of Munster. So my recollection is that it was a pedestrian street, not where cars drive. So lots of shops and restaurants and so on either side. And you'd miss this if you didn't know it was there. When I was there was a local person who pointed this out to us. And it's a unique thing. That square in the middle there, you can kind of see the cross outline. And the white are, I think, representative of dove feathers, perhaps peace. But that thing in the middle is metal and thick glass, and it's a container of water. Water that is mixed from water from the Jordan River and water from a well in Munster that dates back to the 16th century. And then, of course, the writing that you can't see there just has the date 1536 and then the Wiedertäufer or Anabaptists on there. So it's a poignant kind of street monument. It's not very large at all, maybe a couple of feet by a couple of feet at the most. They're not large cobblestones. But I found it, the fact that you trod on this thing with your feet also, to me, adds a bit of poignancy to that monument. And why they chose water from the Jordan yet, like to somehow, is this, yeah, I didn't find a local interpretation, but as all good art, you make your own interpretations.
Yeah.
But to me, that's part of you know, it was obviously a Christian movement of the Munsterites, as well as a Christian movement that put them down.
Right.
And so water from the Jordan would be appropriate, I suppose. But yeah, interesting anyway.
Yeah. Well, and I was intrigued when you sent me this picture, but a little bit disappointed because none of the locals pointed this out to me. So I'll have to make a point.
We had the right person, I guess.
I'll have to make a point to go back and see it, maybe in 2034 for the anniversary.
The 500th, yeah.
So this is a piece of public art in Munster that we both saw and took pictures of. So this is a picture. It obviously there's Jesus on the cross there, and then at the foot of the cross, where normally the disciples and Mary and the women would have been, there are three figures, and they sort of have a look to them that maybe it is disciples in different clothes, but these are, according to the website that I saw, three beatified figures, which means they've become saints since this time, from the area, two women who were nuns and a man who was a Catholic leader who preached against the Nazis and was kicked out of the city for it. But the interesting figure is the guy on the far right, who is he's not at the foot of the cross. He is meekly, coyly off to the side. And this is supposed to be the Jan van Leyden figure. So Gareth, what were some of your first thoughts when you saw this painting, or this statue?
Yeah, I discovered it by accident. First of all, I think we had some free time on our tour, and this was not on the itinerary. So I was just wandering around, and suddenly saw this, and was struck by this. It's like, wow, there's layers of meaning here, and we're going to see an enlargement a little bit later on. But that was my first impression was, why wasn't this on our itinerary. And later, when I led my own tour, I made sure it was on the itinerary. It's kind of stuck behind one of the cathedrals in Munster. It's not in a prominent place. It's kind of in a back alley almost.
Yeah,
it seemed.
I also found it by accident. It's tucked in, not even the main part of the cathedral, like a newer renovated education wing or something. But lots of layers to it. There is a description you can find if you scan the QR code. And I know some of you are already rolling your eyes at the uselessness of QR codes, but that's how I got some of the information about it. So I'll go to the next image.
I always ask for a paper menu at restaurants.
So this is a bit of a closer look at Jan van Leyden. And you can see he's carrying some papers, and at his feet there's a collection of symbols. So I have a zoomed-in picture. I'll go a little bit closer yet.
One thing you can't see there is under his left arm, and I don't think your close-up has it either. Under his left arm, kind of in behind, is the book of Revelation, or it says the Apocalypse on it, or the Revelation of John.
Yeah. There's just Bill, for your reference. There's a pile of things on the ground. I think one more. There we go. So all of these things are at Jan van Leyden's feet. Some very intentional images here. Gareth, what do you see in this?
Yeah, I see both a broken swastika, a broken Star of David, a broken scythe, which I think could be the hammer and scythe from the Russian symbol, some swords, perhaps some pieces of chainmail. The globe there, you were saying, was a representation of Christendom. Then you see a head that's split in half. So almost everything is broken. I think, to me, that's the primary imagery that comes through there, is the brokenness of all of the things that are there.
Yeah. Yeah, earlier on my trip, I spent some time in an art gallery, and you could always lean on the little description beside every painting. And there was no description, there was no tour guide. I had to totally make do with my own devices, which felt a little bit inadequate at the time. But yeah, there's clearly a message. This is a broken movement, a failed leader, disconnected from all kinds of things that he was setting out to do. I'll go to the next.
And of course, some dead leaves kind of add to it there.
Yeah, I don't know if that was the intention or not. Gareth, can you translate the inscription on this?
Yeah, I think this says the New Jerusalem, and
this himmlische, so it would be like heavenly Jerusalem.
Heavenly Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for people who actually know German.
Okay. Yeah, and so that was also sort of part of the brokenness, and you can see there's a break in this. So maybe that's also a statement that their attempt to set up the New Jerusalem or to reestablish the heavenly Jerusalem was also sort of a
and the picture underneath it has a lamb as well as flames coming out of a building. So you have both the coming of the lamb, but also the kind of the destruction happening at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is just the same picture again.
We missed the slide, or the outside of that.
Oh, right.
Outside of the New Jerusalem was also a walled city that represented the walled city of Munster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So everybody's carrying some things. The priest was carrying some of his own writings, and Jan van Leyden has a map of Munster, and so he's mixing the apocalypticism of the Book of Revelation with his own, understanding of grandeur and the defenses of the city and all of that. So maybe on our next trip there, we can connect with a tour guide to break it down a little further.
And of course, you have right from biblical layers to 16th century layers to World War II layers. So it's. I thought it was a very profound sculpture.
Yeah, and there was for me a kind of a pilgrimage effect Of course, when you're traveling, you walk a lot more, and so I had arrived here after probably walking 20,000 steps that day, and then I'm at the foot of Jesus, quite literally, and also engaging with all of this art that no one will explain to me, and yeah, it was a powerful encounter there.
Yeah, I sometimes think, I like to say that when Jesus died, that was the Armistice Day. That was the war to end all wars. And so that just adds that Jesus layer to the sculpture as well.
Right.
And yet the various conflicts, Munster, World War II, or any other global conflicts
Right.
as well,
Yeah.
or local.
Yeah, so one last question, Gareth. In your mind, what is the lesson of Munster? What is it that the contemporary church, the contemporary Mennonite church, should take from this story?
Yeah, and perhaps what I mentioned being Armistice Day is the message that I see here. Maybe put it together with the peace sculpture in the inlay, and I see this as Jesus died to end all wars. It wasn't just some sort of mystical, spiritual take away our sins. It was also, he died so that we wouldn't have to have human sacrifice anymore. And yet we continue to sacrifice human beings in violent ways. And so, to me, that's when I saw this sculpture, that's what I came away with. And I'm not sure with Jan van Leyden, who was an Anabaptist, who he is part of my tradition. The expression on his face, I'm not sure if he's contemplating or if it's some shame that he, got it wrong. And that's part of the beauty of art, is that you don't know exactly, and yet to me that sculpture at the least causes us all to contemplate violence in the world.
Yeah.
And regardless whether people are pacifists or otherwise, I think this sculpture would cause us to reflect on that whole question.
Right. Yeah. Thanks for that. It was interesting to me too, along those same lines. There's some of that ambiguity you see in art sometimes. He's not at the foot of the cross. Did he step away from it, or was he pushed away? The things that are broken, did he break them, or did they simply fall?
Yeah.
There's so much. I liked about the piece. Maybe someday we'll get to engage with the artist in some ways. Yeah, so we'll move to that Q&A time. So for anybody following my podcast, there's a lovely assistant who's been missing from the stage. Robin is here, and she's going to hold the microphone. So if you have a question, then Robin will bring you the microphone. So Robin, you have to go to the back to get the microphone. Oh, you already have it. Oh, look. See, I've underestimated her ability. So, if you have a question about anything you've heard tonight, then go ahead and ask, and one or both of us will weigh in with our real or imagined expertise. Oh. Right there.
I had no idea I'd be asking this question. I quite early in the presentation, I heard you, Gareth, giving us a little explanation about the season, the time, what led to Will's story of Munster, at that time. And as you talk, it seems to me the issues are similar. Uh, would you have a comment on the state of the Catholic Church? Neither of you are presenting them very positively, and of course, we know our history. You know, we're breaking away from the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is alive and well. We have, just recently, our congregation took a few Sundays where nobody was showing up, so we won't have church. Oh my goodness, some of us old-timers were a little bit offended at that. But Verna and I decided we're just going to go up Shaughnessy Boulevard and go to the local Catholic church. The parking lot was full. This was a holiday weekend. There were young people, there were young families, and old people, and so on. And I got to say, the sermon by the priest was very lively and easily understood. So I'm just wondering if you could say something about God's eternal, everlasting presence, 16th century Anabaptists notwithstanding. But lo and behold, we got some struggles now, and that old Catholic Church still seems to be alive.
Yeah, first of all, we are only talking 16th century, when people were also perhaps like today, very polarized. I'll tell you just my personal story is that I had a very profound and deep renewal at Queen's House in Saskatoon at a Roman Catholic Retreat Center. I found myself there in a new way in the contemplative spirituality of that has been kept alive in the Catholic Church. So I think we need to understand that what we're talking about tonight is 500 years ago in the medieval era, not necessarily making any critique of present day at all. This is also one of the reasons why I like Hans Denk. In many ways, Anabaptism has been seen as the radical wing of the Reformation, and I think that's correct. But at the same time, we have just as much connection to medieval mysticism in the Catholic monasteries than we do to Luther and the Reformers. And that has been a part of Anabaptist history that has not been explored as much because of that South German, Moravian strain that is more connected to German mysticism. So that would be a partial answer there for you.
Yeah, if you look at Gareth's painting at the back of the sanctuary here, there's a painting of one of the stained glass windows in the great cathedral in Strasbourg. Gareth and I shared with each other similar experiences that here we were low church Mennonites, with little to no art or anything beautiful in the churches that we grew up in. And we step into these massive churches in Europe where the things happened that we were talking about, where our theological forefathers were arrested, were executed. But in those churches, there's profound beauty. There are profound ways that the people in those pews could experience God through art, through storytelling, through opulence that is uncomfortable to us still today, but those were spaces of awe. And one thing I would offer specifically to the contemporary connection there is, I think in some ways, even for Catholics, the way has become narrow again. Many of us were Mennonites by accident, by default. Well, you can't stay Mennonite by default, not in this world. And I would say the same is true of the Catholics. That yeah, a lot of people are born into the Catholic Church, but you don't just stay there by default. You stay there because you find something of beauty and power there. And so as the prestige in society and as the esteem that they used to have has dwindled a little bit, the sincerity of the people gathering there has gone up. And yeah, so I would also echo Gareth's comments that our criticisms of the Catholic Church are of the corrupted institution in the 16th century, not the one where our brothers and sisters worship today. Any other questions that Robin can bring a microphone to?
Through the things you've talked about today, we can see the roots of many of our Anabaptist principles and beliefs, the adult baptism, the peace church, the separation of church and state. When did things like some of the other things come into place, like simple living? I don't hear any of that in the letter that you've read or some of the history that you've talked about. And there's probably other ones, but that's one of the ones that jumps into mind. When did simple living and why did that come about in the last 500 years?
Right, okay.
Yeah, I would say that was there 500 years ago. And let's make a Catholic connection. Since I'll put the previous question together with this question. One of the connections with medieval mysticism is that the difference was that the Anabaptists thought that everybody should have a rigorous, simple lifestyle like the monks did, not just those who were especially called to monasteries. They thought every Christian should live like a monk, which is why Luther criticized them and said this is the new monkery. Tomorrow I'll be at Menno Simon's Christian School, and I'm going to be talking about Menno goes to school. Most likely, Menno got his education at a Franciscan monastery. Different orders have different values and emphases, but one of the core values of the Franciscans, which I believe became a core value of Menno as well, is that of simplicity, which is the brown. Francis, of course, was from a very wealthy family, sold everything, and just always wore a brown habit. I think some of those values, perhaps even if it isn't stated as such, some of those values may have become also Mennonite or Anabaptist values as well. If you look at the South German Moravians, then you have communal living, which would have been part of, we don't have anything for ourselves, we just look after each other in community, which the Hutterites have placed a rigorous structure around, but I would say it's a value of all people, even if we may not always live it.
Yeah, a couple of things I would add to that is there's always kind of a mix of the theological influences and the social influences. So Conrad Grebel thought that there should be no music in churches, which the music program at Conrad Grebel College would be disappointed to hear about. But he looked in the Bible and there was no instructions there that they should play music during worship. So that was his theological reasoning. While that also sort of came with other things, right? I talked to a couple in our church a while ago. They were having a moral conundrum whether or not they should put a pool table in their basement. Well, there's nothing in the Bible about pool, but growing up, the pool hall was where you smoked and where you drank alcohol and all the things. So for Conrad Grebel, music was something that happened at the bar and was facilitated by alcohol lubrication, right? That's when singing was fun. So we shouldn't sing in our churches. So there was a mix of all of those things. on my same trip, I visited one of the old Mennonite, or I guess Doopsgezind, baptism-minded churches in Amsterdam. And it's this beautiful sanctuary, an elaborate building, but sort of hidden away. And I had a tour guide show me around, and he said that, there were rules, sort of, that you couldn't worship in, Mennonites couldn't build structures. So then they had to hide their structures. This wasn't visible from the road that there was a church there. But he says, hidden is not always forbidden. He said there was kind of an agreement between the Anabaptist group and the government that the government wanted them to sort of hide themselves, to be a little more secretive. And if they would just take a few steps in that direction, then the government could say, listen, we've outlawed this, and it's not visible, it's not a part of our lives. So as long as you're trying to hide it, then it looks to us like we're enforcing it. So a lot of that simplicity happened along those same lines, that Anabaptists were tired of getting persecuted for their beliefs, and the authorities were tired of persecuting them. So if you sort of go a little bit underground and you make your spaces a little bit simple, then we will leave you alone. And there was kind of that agreement, unofficial agreement that was reached, and some of that legacy is still in our churches, that it's better to just keep ourselves under the radar. It's better to not make a fuss. It's better to not draw any attention to ourselves and just live out the Bible in our own little way. There's theological grounding for that, but there's also historical grounding for that. And all of that goes, I think, right back to the same beginnings that we were talking about today. Thanks for the question. Any other questions? Oh, here we go.
I have a question for Will and for Gareth, and that is, when I was taking my history about this era, this Peasants' War took on a much more economic clout. And what it was not the theologians had inspired the Anabaptists so much, it was that their end times theology and their equality and their leaving, expecting the next year to be the coming of Christ, there was no need for the peasants to harvest. There was no need for them to work on their estates. There was no need for them to do any food production, fishing, timber. And the powers that be further up the economic ladder said, our labor force is disappearing across the Red Sea. We better get them back. So essentially, it was an economic movement to suppress them, and the Anabaptists just kind of got caught up because they were so visible. But maybe that explains some of the ferocity which it was put down, because people genuinely thought starvation was facing Europe if they didn't get those peasants back behind the plow.
Right.
Yeah, even our faith today is often more mixed up with economics and politics than we like to think. And the same as in the 16th century. Believers' baptism, sure, yes, it was a different interpretation of Scripture, but at the same time, if you weren't baptizing your infants, you couldn't be collecting taxes, because then you didn't know who a citizen was. So it was also economic reasons they got killed, not just theological ones. Very good point. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think part of that too is, the Radical Reformation sometimes gets called the Third Way, and when the Reformation starts with Luther and Luther fighting the Catholics and that kind of back and forth, they're still sort of propping up the regular institutions, but the Anabaptists kind of shined a light on a lot of things that everybody was taking for granted, right? The tie of baptism to citizenship. Luther didn't have a problem with that, but it took a third way of looking at things to sort of call out, okay, should this be connected? And it was absolutely taken for granted then. Now, almost nobody has a problem with a baptism happening in a non-government regulated space. Nobody has a problem with that now. But it took an outside group, a group that was willing to put themselves on the outside to, I think, shine a light on where the shadows had developed within the church. Thanks for the question, Mike.
Maybe time for one more.
Yeah, up here. We've got a microphone coming for you, Eugene.
I don't quite understand who the persecutors were in the 16th century. That's not clear to me. Help me with that, please.
Well, nobody was getting along with anybody. But the Anabaptists were persecuted by both Reformers, Lutherans, and Catholics in the 16th century. But the Anabaptists also didn't have any nice things to say about the Lutherans, Reformers, and Catholics. But the persecutors were those three groups.
Yeah, and when the church and state are connected, then if you upset one, you upset the other, right? If you've committed a crime that the state doesn't like, the church isn't going to give you communion anymore. If you've committed a cardinal crime that the church doesn't like, then you can't register your business anymore. All of it is connected that way. So Felix Mons, who's part of the same study group as Conor Grable, when he's executed in 1527, the letter that's read off that authorizes and states why they have the right to execute him was signed by Ulrich Zwingli, because that execution was granted or given authorization by the church. Now, Ulrich Zwingli didn't push him in the water. That was the police or the soldiers of the state. But you know, who's doing it? Just like who executed Jesus? Well, the Jews had a part, the Romans had a part, but they could both also at the same time say, well, it wasn't us, we're just doing what they said.
By the way, a great way to end, I think, would be to mention that there's a letter in my book by Rev. Rudy Reich, a Reformed pastor in Zurich. There have been in the last decade or so meetings between Anabaptists, Reformers, Lutherans, as well as Catholics, working at reconciliation over that bloody era in the 16th century. So I think that's, to me, a good news story. When Reverend Reich led us on that part of the tour in Zurich, it was special to hear him talk about that incident. And I've because he's deceased, I asked permission, and it's now what do you call that when a document is available to the public?
Posthumously?
Yeah. Anyway, so I have included that letter. That is a modern day kind of reconciliation from the time of persecution in the 16th century. So I think that's a great news story that we live in a different time. It doesn't mean there isn't polarization, but there are some good things happening among various Christian groups.
All right. Well, thanks, Gareth, for sharing all of this with us. Thanks to all of you for coming out tonight, for listening and engaging us with questions. And yeah, feel free to stick around and chat. There's still some treats in the foyer. And thanks again for coming out tonight.